carry out their ministries in different places and in different ways. And as we approach Independence Day, I wonder if you heard this statistic, which stays with me. If you look at the all-time best-selling musical acts in the UK and the all-time best-selling musical acts in the United States, in the UK they're all groups, and in the United States they're all solo artists. Now why would that be? And what does that say about our national character and how we're different from others? And I guess my prayer would be, if I need a collaborator, what maybe the way Cyril and the Thorgies work together, or in a certain way maybe Augustine and Monica, if I need a collaborator to carry out what God is asking me to do in this world, my prayer would be send me that collaborator, send me someone to work with. And if I'm called to do a solo act like St. Giroux, then give me the fortitude to see that through, because I think that's a hard road to walk. I think that's really what I want to share. And I appreciate this organization, and I remain at your service.
Thanks so much. All right, it's now time to introduce our speaker for this evening. So to give a little bit of an intro, our speaker tonight is a husband and father who works as a pediatrician in Detroit, Michigan. His professional training has led him from childhood home Dallas, Texas to Phoenix, Arizona, and now, of course, here in Michigan. Inspired by becoming a father himself, he's created Docs to Dads, a podcast to help them enjoy fatherhood and to become experts in their own health and the health of their children. Since then, he's dedicated his time supporting dads and intentionally building fulfilling professional and family lives. Our speaker's fulfilling family life comes from traveling and spending time with his wife and 3 kids. Let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Scott France.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me okay with this at this volume. I'll try to speak up a little bit. I'm very honored to be here with you today. As I was planning to do this and trying to coordinate with my wife to see if we could find some childcare for our 3 kids so that she could be here to laugh at my canned jokes and encourage you all to do that as well. We were sort of reminiscing on when we first got involved in YCP back in our Phoenix days when we were sort of newlyweds and didn't have any kids, and our night was like just ready to begin when we headed out to listen to the speaker and then go to the after party afterwards. And then now we were talking about it the other day, and she was like, "Are you sure you can't talk earlier?" And I was like, "Yeah, I wish I could talk earlier too, because it's bedtime now." So we're usually trying to wrestle our 3 kids into bed around now. That's Grandma's job tonight. So I'm very, very honored to be here with you today. But it's sort of, that must be the moment when you graduate from YCP and you move on to like whatever mid-career Catholic professionals. Maybe that's a new organization that needs to start. We'll just meet a couple of hours earlier, or like at 6 a.m. when all of our kids are awake anyway. I'll acknowledge that this talk is one that I'm a little anxious about, because I think a lot of times when you hear these sorts of talks, there's conversations about some dramatic conversion story that might have happened, or I was raised a Catholic but I fell away, and that's not my story. I don't have a very interesting story in a lot of ways, and so I'm blessed for that, I think, but it sort of makes my story a little more difficult to tell. I grew up, as was mentioned, in Dallas, Texas, cradle Catholic. My mom was actually the first cradle Catholic of our family. She was born shortly after my grandparents converted, and my dad actually converted after my younger brother was born, and so my dad was actually the last Catholic of our family, because my brother and I had already been baptized into the church at that point. And so I grew up with the blessing of having a sort of both sides, the sort of lifelong dedication of my mom to the church and the things that taught me, but the zeal that comes with being a convert that my dad brought to the picture, who sort of came to this on his own. And so I feel very honored that that's my heritage, and I learned a lot from that. And so I was raised with an understanding that going to church was really important. It was something that we made a priority every week. Every Sunday we made it to Mass. When I had soccer tournaments out of town, my parents were always there, and I would get up at 6:30 in the morning to go to Mass at some random church in whatever small town in Texas we were playing soccer in that weekend, and we made sure that we went to Mass. The best story of this is actually in high school we took a trip to Disneyland in California, and my mom actually went on that trip, not as a chaperone, separately, so that she could steal me away from the hotel first thing Sunday morning to go to Mass at 7:30 in the morning before I went to Disneyland with the rest of my friends. And so that sort of gives you some idea of the crazy Catholic family that I was blessed to be raised in. And so then when I went to college, I continued to go to church. I didn't have a crisis of faith at any point. I lived a very boring life in college where I went to Mass every Sunday, and then I was very lucky to find a wonderful woman who is a faithful Catholic and was raised in a wonderful Catholic home as well. And now we have 3 kids of our own that we're trying to raise in a wonderful Catholic home, and that's the most important thing about my life. And so I get a little emotional talking about that. But so as I was reflecting on that's not a particularly interesting story. It's deeply meaningful to me, but there's no sort of aha moment where I realized that I needed to change my ways or anything like that. And where I came to was this idea that the way that I have been taught to live out my faith is sort of in these everyday moments. And so what are the ways that we can be a witness for Christ in just the everyday moments? Because sometimes you're going to have aha moments. There's going to be, big things that happen in life. But so much of the work that comes as we build people towards those aha moments are from those little acts of witness that you can provide sort of on a day-to-day basis. And so it's those sort of seemingly mundane moments where you're talking about your life and you're talking about your day-to-day interactions with your wife and your kids or with your own parents or whoever the case may be, where you have those opportunities to speak out about that. And so as I apply that to my work as a pediatrician, I went to medical school in El Paso, Texas, and did my residency at Phoenix Children's Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, and then subsequently moved here. And in my time and my formation as a pediatrician, I've developed a particular interest in families that have been affected by trauma and adversity. And I think a lot of that comes from my upbringing as, in the world of Catholic social teaching and the seeking of justice and the recognition of human dignity. And so those are some of the ways that I think I live that out in my day-to-day life. And so I've developed this reputation amongst the people that I work for and the residents that I have the honor to train over at Children's Hospital for being particularly good with a particular subset of patients. And those are the difficult families, right? The families that don't always listen, they don't always tell you, they don't always do what you ask them to do. They can be a little bit challenging. Sometimes they can get a little heated. And I've had multiple times when residents have said to me, we're really glad that you're going to be the person to sort of come alongside this family and help them because you're particularly good in this situation. And I've had the honor to know a number of physicians that are good in these types of situations. My wife is one of them, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Many of my mentors have been the same, and I think the thing that ties them all together and the thing that I aspire to is sort of 2 common traits. The first is that they stand firm in their identity on the firm foundation of Christ, and the second is that they have developed the ability to see Christ in others. And I think that if we can develop those 2 skills, and these are habits that you can develop over time. You can take specific steps to get to develop these skills. You can live out the everyday witness in a similar way. And so, when it comes to standing on firm ground, one of the things that I talk about when I'm talking to the residents about families that we have the opportunity to serve in the hospital in particular is that we sort of get used to being there. As people who work in the hospital, we're there every day. We kind of come and go. It seems very normal to us to be in the hospital. But for the patients and families that we serve, this is the worst day of their life in most cases. And so most of the time, these families feel like the firm ground that they were standing on has been ripped out from under them. And they don't know what's going to happen next. In our case, it's particularly traumatic for a lot of them because we're talking to parents about their children who are the human being that they love most in the entire universe. And that's a very heavy weight that we have the honor to help them carry. And so they feel like that ground has been pulled out from underneath them. And the way that we can best serve them is try to help them find that foundation under their feet again. And we can only do that for them if we know the foundation that we are standing on, right? And so sometimes that looks very practical. That's talking to them about, who's going to be coming and going from the room, how long do we expect for your child to be here, how many more pokes do we have to give this poor kid to draw more blood for more labs, and it can get very overwhelming for the child and for the parents. But sometimes we're called upon to provide them with more of a foundation. They need a little bit more support because they feel like the ground has been ripped out from underneath them and they're needing that extra little bit of help. And so one of the ways that I envision this is I can only help them find firm foundation under themselves again if I've got the firm foundation under me. And so it reminds me, we were here for Encounter, which is an adoration experience that we have here monthly, either here or at St. Clair, and I'm honored to play the drums for the music group in that context. And this month our priest gave a talk about, this was just last weekend, about Matthew 7. I just want to read it because it was sort of an aha moment for me as a way to kind of pull this talk together. And so in Matthew 7, starting in verse 24, it says, "Therefore everyone who hears the words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock." And I think that this is a way that I think about how do we build our life intentionally and in a meaningful way to be able to stand firm when others, and then be able to provide that to the people that we serve, right? And for me, that's families in clinic. For you, that might be coworkers that you have, colleagues, clients that you serve. How can you sort of be that sort of stable, reliable person that somebody can come to when they're having those moments? And I think the answer comes from one of my favorite praise songs that we also sang this weekend, which is called Build My Life. And the words of that song say, "I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken." And I think that's such a powerful thing that I come back to whenever I'm feeling like I need to sort of reestablish that firm foundation under myself. And so what are the practical ways, what does that look like? One of the things with my podcast that my wife always talks about is you're really good with the theory stuff, but you got to get practical. So let's do practical. What does this actually look like when we're trying to establish that firm foundation under ourselves that we can stand on? Obviously, it starts with spending time with God. You've got to be in the Word. There are ways to do that on the go. Father Mike Schmitz's Bible in a Year podcast, I can't recommend highly enough. I did that last year, and it was a really meaningful experience for me. And I think that's a really great place to start. But just spending time in the Word with God, spending time at daily Mass whenever you have the opportunity to go, certainly going to Mass every weekend as a priority, and make sure that takes priority over other things. Spending that regular time in prayer for me has helped me develop more sort of emotional regulation type skills where I'm able to keep myself calmer and more collected in those heated moments when things are going wrong and a child needs me to react quickly and correctly to care for them. And so I strongly recommend spending some time in prayer silently every day, just to reconnect with God and develop. You'll find that there are also some non-spiritual benefits to that as well, and that's really useful. It also requires us to educate ourselves, right? And so I'm a big podcast listener as a podcast producer myself, so there's certainly a lot of really great podcasts out there that you can use to affirm your identity in Christ and really firm up that foundation underneath you. I live in the Catholic men's space, so most of my recommendations are going to be for the men in the room more. So, Catholic Man Show is a show that I can't recommend highly enough. It's really a great experience. Catholic Talk Show, Pints with Aquinas, Council of Trent. These are really great resources. Some of them are a little bit more spiritual, like how do we live our day-to-day life. Council of Trent is by a guy named Trent Horn, who does more like educational, like breakdown of like understanding church teachings. And I think there's value in both of those kinds. So spending time in each of those. I will encourage when we shortly arrive to the Q&A portion of this or the more community, I will welcome, I'm sure, the number of great Catholic women's podcasts that exist in the universe. I'm just personally not aware of them, but I'm confident that they exist. So we'll try to put together a resource list for everyone. But using those types of resources can be really great. And this will all help you build your life more intentionally. And I think a lot about this in the context of your built environment. So you have control over the space that's around you. So taking advantage of things like holy images that you can have in your home that will remind you to pause and reflect. Once you have kids, this is a really great way to sort of have these images up. So we have like probably a dozen Holy Families around our house in various places because I have a particular devotion to the Holy Family. And so it's really fun now to talk to our kids as they get older about like who are the people in these pictures, and they're starting to really understand the concept of the Holy Family and those kinds of things, which is really meaningful for me. Thinking about this in the context of what type of media are we consuming? How much time are we spending consuming that media? And those kinds of things is another way that we can think about that. The other thing that I learned when I was very young that I encourage all of you to do is to pray in public. And this can feel a little bit uncomfortable if you weren't raised doing it, but growing up, anytime we went out to dinner at a restaurant, we always said our prayer with the sign of the cross. We got some weird looks. We were down in the Bible Belt. We were those weird Catholics. But this is a powerful way to express within your family, but also to the outside world, like who you are and who you stand for. And I would encourage you to do that. And you never know, if you're just sitting in the lunchroom or sitting at your desk, eating lunch, you never know what that sign of the cross, somebody might see you do that, and that might draw them to you when they're having a moment of need or something like that. And then community. I think this is one of the most important things. Like, we can only do so much of this ourselves, right? And that sort of ties in well with the brother's commentary about trying to be in a band versus trying to go solo. I would say it is infinitely more difficult to go solo. And so if you have a choice, try to find collaborators. Try to get plugged into a community. When we first moved here, we didn't really know anybody, and that's when we discovered Ann Graves, or I can only say that God sent us Ann Graves. We were in a tough time. It was our first winter here. We hadn't seen the sun in 6.5 weeks. It was very cold. I was shoveling snow for the first time in my life. We had actually just had a miscarriage in that season of our life, and so it was tough. And that was when God sent Ann Graves to us, and she got us plugged into this community at St. Paul on the lake, and we have since found so many great friends, other young families that have kids around the same ages as ours. And wherever you are, like, find a way to get plugged into a parish, find a way to get plugged into a men's group or a women's group or a Bible study or something. Here at St. Paul in the Lake, I'll plug this tomorrow morning, every Thursday morning from 7 to 8, we have a men's group that meets. So if you're somewhere local to here, please come and hang out with us some Thursday morning. We have a really great time. Ryan comes sometimes. We have a really good time. So, but find that community of people so that you're not trying to do this by yourself, because it's much easier and much more fun if you don't do it by yourself. I had some comments about domestic church that I'm going to leave to the side, but if that's something that we want to talk about more, I'm happy to cover that more in the Q&A session. But as you start to build towards the season of life where you're getting engaged and getting married and having kids, thinking really intentionally about the way that you build and lead your domestic church as a partnership. I'm so lucky to have my wife who believes in this alongside me, and we work together very hard to engage our kids in going to Mass and get them excited about going to church, to the point where I try to come to daily Mass by myself, and my kids will not let me out of the house without bringing them with me, right? And so we can talk more about that in the Q&A session if you want to hear more about that. But I want to move on a little bit to seeing Christ in other people. Because once you have that firm foundation, you're prepared to go out into the world, and you want to be able to serve them effectively. And I have found, for me, the most effective way to do that is to see Christ in that other person. And I think that that's something that people say a lot. And it's yeah, Christ is in everybody, and we should see them and show them dignity and respect and all these kinds of things. And I think when we think about that, we're thinking about people who look like us, who have the same worldview that we do, who live in the same neighborhoods that we do. It's easier to see Christ in those people. Where it gets more difficult is do you see Christ in people who don't fit in those categories? Do you see Christ in the people who have been forgotten, who have been pushed aside by society? The sick, is who I take the most care of in my professional role. And where I learned this most effectively was in medical school in El Paso, Texas. So if you don't know where El Paso, Texas is, it's basically as far west in Texas as you can get. If you imagine the shape of the state of Texas, that little triangle bit that's off west, it's way up in the point of that triangle. And it's right on the border with Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, which during the 4 years that I was there was the most dangerous city in the world. It has since been taken over by various places around the world, but in the time that I was there, we were forbidden from going across the border, which was a big shame because prior to Ciudad Juarez becoming the most dangerous city in the world, there was a very vibrant culture of moving back and forth across the border. Think of the way that Detroit interacts with Windsor, right? Very similar. You'd go across the border for dinner and come back, or you go spend the night across the border, or whatever the case may be. There's this vibrant culture there around this sort of twin cities area of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. But especially in those days, there were a lot of people who were the victim of violence. There was a lot of poverty that was happening just across the border from us. And you could actually, as you're driving from where I lived in El Paso to drive to downtown, you had to kind of go up and around this mountain, and you could actually see over the border into some of the most impoverished parts of Ciudad Juarez. And in the safety net hospital where we did our medical training, we took care of these patients who would come to us seeking care much later than our American patients would, because they had to figure out how to get across the border, because they didn't have the money because of a variety of issues. And so these people had very advanced disease. These people did not have good hygienes. These folks had diabetes that was so bad they had foot wounds that had maggots inside of them. These are the people that we have to look at and see Christ in, because it's easy, if you can imagine the picture of this, maybe even worse, to imagine the smell of what was going on with some of these patients. Those are the folks that you have to see Christ in as well, right? And maybe even harder than that, so I have this easy because almost everyone can look into the face of an innocent child and see Christ. So I always tell my adult physician counterparts that I took the easy way out because it's really easy to take care of kids and much more difficult to take care of adults for this reason. But maybe it's even harder to see Christ in a parent who's yelling at you when you didn't do anything wrong, and they're just frustrated because they feel like the ground has been ripped out from under them, like we were talking about before, and they don't know what's going to happen next, and they're scared about what's going to happen to their child. And you're the person that's standing in front of them. And so you're getting the full unload, right? Can we see Christ in that person? And what does that look like? So again, trying to get practical, how do we do this? And so I think this is a place where we can learn from saints who did this well in the past. So for me, my confirmation saint is St. Vincent de Paul, who I think lived this out really effectively. And so I had maybe a little bit of a head start because I spent a lot of time going through my confirmation formation studying all about St. Vincent de Paul, who was a man who lived in France and basically dedicated his whole life to serving the poor, the poorest of the poor. And he actually did it in creative ways by finding patrons of the rich and wealthy of France and finding ways to get them to set up programs and donate money to help care for these poorest of the poor, which is what I try to imagine I do in some small way with the patients that I get to take care of. St. Teresa of Calcutta is another great example of somebody who dedicated their life to service and dedicating their life to seeing Christ in everybody that she served. And so taking time to read the works and read about the lives of these saints is another way to do that. Sometimes it's just a gentle reminder when you feel yourself struggling maybe to see Christ in somebody, to ask yourself, what's the most charitable interpretation of what's happening here right now, right? So like this mom who's yelling at me, I could get frustrated with her, what are you yelling at me for? I didn't do this, I didn't cause it, I'm doing everything that I can to help. Why are you yelling at me? Or I can think, what's the most charitable interpretation of this? And say, this is a mom who just is feeling frustrated. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She's worried that something terrible is about to happen to her child, or it already has. And so she just needs somebody to sit and listen to her concerns and help her understand what the next steps are going to be. And if I don't internalize those feelings, and I don't internalize that, and I focus instead on trying to bring Christ to her and see Christ in her, then that's a way that I can serve her more effectively. And so that is how I came to this idea of just being an everyday witness. Right? These are not big moments most of the time. You'll come across these just in your day-to-day life as you're interacting with your colleagues, as you're having lunch in the lunchroom, as you're meeting people at the grocery store. You're going to run into these types of situations. But there are things that you can do every day to develop these habits and to find yourself on a firm foundation with Christ and to prepare yourself, right? And on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, Peter tells us to always be prepared to make a defense and to account for the hope that is in you, right? Because this is going to look hopeful to a lot of people. You're going to look different if you do these things from a lot of the other folks. And right now in our world, we're having a crisis of meaning. These elevated rates of depression and anxiety that we're seeing in young people and in the teenagers that I'm taking care of, so much of this has to do with a crisis of meaning. And so if you are living this way and you're that person that's standing on a firm foundation and won't be shaken, people are going to notice that. And you have to be prepared for that moment. And so one of the biggest compliments that I get from the residents that I work with is they'll say something along the lines of, Dr. Grant, you give us hope that I can have a good career and also a meaningful family life, that I can find that work-life balance that I'm looking for, because there's something about me that looks different from many of my colleagues. And that is, the joy that I get from my relationship with God and with Christ, and the joy that I get from my family. And I think that one of the things that sets me apart in those ways is how much I talk about my family. I sort of, in my bio, and I do this anytime somebody asks me for a bio, I'm very, very intentional about including the fact that I'm a husband and a father before the fact that I'm a pediatrician, because that's the order in which I think about them and the order in which I see their value in my life, right? So the most important thing that I do every day relates to my relationship with God. So setting aside that time for prayer, to be in the Word, is first. Next, for me, because of the season of life that I'm in, next is my responsibility as a husband, then as a father, and then everything else. A friend, a pediatrician, all the other things that I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that it comes from that series of perspective that allows me then to look different to the other folks that I interact with on a day-to-day basis, and to the residents who are looking for examples of people who seem to have reasonable work-life balance, which I think I've been able to accomplish. And so as you look different, as you start to do these things or continue to do them, I'm sure many of these things are things that a lot of you do daily, folks are going to notice, and they're going to be drawn to you because they're going to say, there's something different about you, and I want whatever that is. And it doesn't come from Bible thumping, right? It doesn't come from my quoting scripture 600 times a day, right? I don't go into patient rooms and start reciting healing prayers over them all the time necessarily. Sometimes that does come up in conversations with families. But it just comes from the way that I interact with people differently because of the firm foundation that I'm working to develop and the active steps that I try to take to see Christ in others. And I don't do this perfectly. I struggle with this every day. But it's something that I think about every day. One of the best pieces of advice I got when I was in training was when you're walking up to a patient room to walk into that room, you want to remember to be present in the room with that family. And so that mentor told me, when you walk up to the door, just stop for a second. And whatever else is happening in the universe behind you, it stays behind, and you walk in and you serve that family in that moment for that period of time. And then you walk in and it allows me to be more present. And so to this day, every time I walk into a patient room, I think about that. I stop. And that's something that you can do before you walk into any meeting, before you walk into anybody else's office, before you go meet with a client for lunch. Just take a moment and say, whatever else is happening out here, we're leaving this behind for a moment because there might be an opportunity in this conversation to make a difference. There might be an opportunity in this conversation to witness to Christ. And that's the way that we can be everyday witnesses to Christ in our workplace. I want to thank you very much for your time. You should also text in your recommendations for Catholic women's podcasts, because I'm sorry, that's a failure of mine, but text those in so we can get a list together so that people know we should share the great work that's being done around. I just am not, I don't live in that world. I know the one I do know about is the Archdiocese of Detroit actually has a parenting podcast that's done by a couple of really great moms. And so like, it's much more from a mom's perspective. I'll just leave it at that. But it's really great. It's really great. So check that one out if you're in the mom season of life.
So let's kick things off with a question. You spent time talking about everyday moments with family, with patients. Have you ever had any particular challenges with colleagues at your work? Trying to exhibit those everyday graces that you spoke about?
Sure. I think, the flip side to everyone knowing who you are and that you're living differently is that you're going to stand out for a variety of reasons. And so I'll acknowledge that, it's not a surprise to most of my colleagues that I'm sort of, a particularly religious person. And so as things come up in the news and those kinds of things, I get a lot more questions about those kinds of things. So especially, leading up to the 2020 election, I had to have a lot of conversations about how could anyone possibly vote for that guy or whatever. And in the aftermath of the Dobbs leak and the subsequent Dobbs decision, I got a lot of questions about those kinds of things. And that's where the preparation comes in, and I think that if you feel confident to speak on those issues, you should feel, empowered to do so in a loving way. I'm fortunate, my wife is very involved in the pro-life community here at St. Paul. It's a very important topic to her and to me as well, but I've learned so much from her about that issue in particular that I felt prepared to make remarks about that. But if you're not prepared, I think you just don't feel bullied into needing to take a position or to feel the need to defend the church's teaching on whatever particular issue if you get challenged on those things. But the more you can be prepared and know what the Catholic Church teaches about these issues, the better. Especially because most of the time the church's teaching comes from a place of love and a place of seeking the good of the person involved. And so if you can remember that perspective, and again, see Christ in the person that's challenging you. See Christ in the person and prioritize sort of building that relationship, and their willingness to come and have a conversation with you is a sign that there might be some ground there to be covered and that you could have a meaningful dialogue with them. You'll learn pretty quickly if that's not the case. But the fact that they reached out to you might be a sign that they're open to learning more about what the church teaches about these issues, and so you can kind of move forward from there.
This person asks, how did you make your kids excited about going to church?
Yeah, this is great. I think one is you take them. You have to take your kids to church and show them what is happening at church. It's not fair to sort of take them to church and then church just become a place where we sit quietly for an hour. There's really important things happening up at the front of the church, and so the more you sort of engage them, and I sort of give really countercultural advice about this, but not only should you take your kids to church, but you should try to sit them as close to the front as possible so they can actually see what's happening. They can see that the priest is reading and that the priest is talking. Then they can get really excited when they see the host and the chalice and point out all of these really cool, really important things that are happening up on the altar during Mass. And so we have the rule that we sort of generally go by is anytime we're in church, we have to use our quiet voice because people are praying and there's important things happening. But if you see something exciting, we can talk about that. And sometimes that's a quiet conversation in the pew, or sometimes it's something we have to talk about more in depth later on. But if you imagine when you take your kids anywhere else, right? You go to the zoo, you go to the museum, they're running around, they're curious, they want to learn, right? And so the same thing can be true in church if you make it seem like a cool place that you're going and they can learn about stuff. And so I think that's sort of the different approach that we've taken. And then now I think, especially with the daily Mass, I think my kids see it as an opportunity for one-on-one time with whichever my wife or I are going. And so I think that they look to that as well. So not only is it an opportunity to sort of show them how important church is, but it's an opportunity for me to invest in my relationship with my kids individually. And so they get excited about that. I could talk about that for a long time. If you want to talk more about that, come find me, and I'm happy to engage more on that question. But they'll think it's fun if you make it seem fun, right? It's like just like anything else with kids, and my kids are almost 5 and just turned 3. And I have a 9-month-old. He's not quite so enthusiastic quite yet, but they get excited about what you're excited about. So if you make it a priority and this is a thing we're all going to do together as a family because it's important, and this is particularly true, 2 more seconds, for the men in the room, there is really good social science data that shows that the most important variable to whether kids are going to be lifelong church attendees is what their father does. So when you get to the season of life where you have kids of your own, if you want them to be regular church attendees, you got to make it fun. Right? So we can talk more about that too later, but there is really, really good social science evidence that the father is the key figure when it comes to lifelong church attendance. And certainly there are outliers. There are probably folks in this room who grew up without fathers or with fathers who did not regularly attend church. But if you want to set your kids up for the biggest chance of success in terms of long-term church attendance, it really comes down to the fathers. And I guess women picking a partner in this field is really, really important as well.
Maybe one last question. And again, if your question didn't get answered, I'm sure you will be sticking around.
I'll be around.
Awesome. Yeah, so maybe wrap things up. Obviously you're a busy man, right? You got the podcast, you got work, you got your family. In regards to building community, you run into a challenge of keeping intimacy of a faithful Catholic circle versus being open and welcoming to other folks as well.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge. There can sometimes be a tension there. I think for us, part of this is because we moved here with no other relationships, that our primary community has evolved from this parish community which we've gotten involved in. So I certainly recognize that can be a challenge. I think that you want to surround yourself with people that are affirming, at least in some way, to the worldview and life that you want to lead. And especially when you get to the season where you're married and you're having kids and those friends of yours are going to be around your kids, you have to think pretty carefully about what is the language that's going to be used? What is the, what types of media might my kids be exposed to if they're hanging around these friends of mine? Would I be proud that these are my friends? Would I want my son to look up to these other men that are in my social circle? And I think that it's certainly possible that you could find other faithful Christian men, or even people of other faiths, or others who live a highly ethical life that your children could look up to. But I have found that most effective by finding a community of Catholic and Christian brothers that I surround my family with, and I feel very blessed by this community that we have 5 or 6 other families that have kids about the same age as ours, and all of these men are good, upstanding men that I would be very proud if my son wanted to grow up and be like any of them somewhere down the road. And I think that's a thing that I think about a lot.
Dr. Grant, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure having you. Thank you from all of us at YCP. We want to present you with this statue of our patron saint, St. Joseph.
Oh, that's great.
Again, thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you so much.
And again, if your question hasn't been answered, you're around.
Here I am.
Please come find and ask a question. I'm going to hand the proverbial mic off to Erin, who's going to lead us with a few announcements.
Yes, we have the drawing, and we have the big run for that. But first, I want to talk about my leadership. I've been seeing me on social media. I also plug, please follow us on social media. I have these brochures that everyone will have. Some of the leadership has them.
Jose Escutia. All right.
You are going to probably get one of those, so make sure you bring your friends and you can get it as well. And then the last thing, I want to thank you guys all for coming. We really appreciate it. A lot of your faces, a lot of people with drawings, so that was great. Also want to thank our sponsors, Alliance Catholic Credit Union, Penske Corporation, Clarence Technologies, Lear Corporation, GTE, and Fine Arts. We wouldn't be able to put this all on without them, so we're super thankful. And again, thankful to all of you guys. We hope to see you at the next events coming up. We have the volunteer event July 15th. We don't know the location yet, so stay tuned on the website, social media, we'll get that out. That'll be Saturday morning. And then another executive speaker series, same thing as this, Cathedral of the Most Blessed Sacrament, that'll be July 26th. And then August 18th, we're doing a networking happy hour at Jimmy John's Field. So game starts at 7:05. More details to come on that, and you can sign up for that. That should be super fun as well. So that is all the announcements. Oh, last week after parties at the Doe Cafe, a few miles away. The spelling, I don't know if you guys have heard of this. Cadieux Cafe, sorry. Show it out this time. C-A-G-I-E-U-X. That is how you spell it. And in conclusion, we're going to end with our prayer to St. Joseph, who should be on the card on the back.
The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Joseph, by the work of your hands and the sweat of your brow, you supported Jesus and Mary, and had the Son of God as your fellow worker. Teach me to work as you did, with patience and perseverance, for God and for those whom God has given me to support. Teach me to see in my fellow workers the Christ who desires to be in them, that I may always be charitable and forbearing towards all. Grant me to look upon work with the eyes of faith, so that I shall recognize in it my share in God's own creative activity and in Christ's work of our redemption, and so take pride in it. When it is pleasant and productive, remind me to give thanks to God for it. And when it is burdensome, teach me to offer it to God in reparation for my sins and the sins of the world.